The Gatton murders remain one of the most disturbing and perplexing unsolved cases in Australian history. Over a century later, theories still circulate, from a local killer with a personal vendetta to the possibility of a ritualistic or serial attack. Some believe the answer was covered up, buried by police incompetence or even deliberate interference. Others think the killer was simply too clever, too ruthless, and too careful to ever be caught. Who murdered Michael, Nora, and Teresa Murphy? Why was their crime scene staged in such an unsettling manner? And how did a town that should have been able to recognize its own monster instead let him disappear into history without a single trace? To understand the chilling events of that night, we must go back to the beginning, to the Murphy family, their last known movements, and the fateful journey that sealed their fate forever. The quiet town of Gatton, Queensland, nestled among rolling hills and farmland, was the kind of place where crime was almost unheard of. Life in the late 19th century was simple, defined by hard work, close communities, and the rhythms of the land. People knew their neighbors, and suspicion was a rare thing. That changed forever on the night of December 26, 1898, when three siblings set out on a short trip and never returned home. The next morning, the Murphy family awoke to an eerie silence. Their three children, Michael, Nora, and Teresa, had been expected home the previous evening after attending a local dance. But they never arrived. The family's worst fears were realized when a search party discovered their lifeless bodies in a remote paddock just outside town. What they found was not just a murder, but a scene so horrific, so bizarre, that it would haunt Gatton for generations. The siblings had been bludgeoned to death, their bodies deliberately arranged in an unsettling formation. Michael's horse had been shot and lay lifeless nearby. The crime had no clear motive. Nothing had been stolen, and the sheer brutality of the attack suggested something far more sinister than a simple act of violence. In an era before forensic science, DNA evidence, or criminal profiling, investigators were left with more questions than answers. No witnesses had seen or heard a thing, and within hours of the discovery, the crime scene was hopelessly contaminated by curious onlookers, corrupt officials, and law enforcement failures that would become one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in Australian history. The bungled investigation would leave the Murphy family with no justice, the town with a crime it could never explain, and historians with a case that would never find closure. The Murphy family was well known in Gatton, a respected farming family, with strong ties to the local community. They lived on a modest property just outside of town, where they worked the land and tended to their livestock. Like most families in rural Australia at the time, their days were defined by hard work and simple routines. The eldest of the siblings, Michael Murphy, was 29 years old, a strong and capable man who had once served as a police officer before returning home to help with the farm. He was well-liked, disciplined, and considered trustworthy by those who knew him. If Michael had an enemy, no one knew about it. No one. Nora Murphy, 27 years old, was known for her kindness and devotion to her family. She had a strong moral compass, was deeply religious, and was said to be warm and gentle in nature. The youngest of the three, Teresa Murphy, was only 18 years old. She was described as lively, beautiful, and full of promise. Her youth and charm made her a well-known figure in the community, and she had no known conflicts with anyone. On December 26, 1898, the Murphy siblings decided to attend a local dance in Gatton, a small event that would allow them to enjoy the post-Christmas festivities. The dance was supposed to be held at a small public hall in town, a popular place for locals to gather, socialize, and enjoy an evening away from farm life. That evening, Michael set out with his sisters in a horse-drawn sulky, a light two-wheeled carriage commonly used at the time. The journey should have been uneventful. It was only about 7 miles from their home to the town of Gatton, a route they had taken many times before. But when the siblings arrived, they found the hall empty. The dance had been unexpectedly cancelled. With no event to attend, Michael, Nora, and Teresa turned around and began the journey home. Somewhere along that road, they met their killer. When the Murphy siblings failed to return home, their family immediately grew concerned. By dawn, on December 27, 1898, their brother Timothy Murphy set out on horseback to search for them. He followed their expected route, his anxiety growing with every passing mile. Roughly 2 miles outside of Gatton, Timothy came across a ghastly sight. The Murphy siblings, sulky, standing abandoned in an open paddock, the horse still harnessed but unmoving. Then he saw the bodies. Michael, Nora, and Teresa lay lifeless. In the tall grass, their bodies arranged in a disturbing pattern. Timothy, horrified and overcome with grief, rode back to town as fast as he could. He alerted the local authorities, who in turn called for assistance from Brisbane. But as the hours passed, the first crucial mistakes of the investigation were already being made. Instead of immediately securing the crime scene, word spread quickly throughout Gatton, and soon dozens of locals, some driven by curiosity, others simply in disbelief, descended upon the area, trampling over the evidence and contaminating what should have been a preserved crime scene. By the time law enforcement officially arrived, any hope of recovering clean forensic evidence had already been destroyed. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary murder. The Murphys had not simply been attacked, they had been brutally beaten, their bodies staged, and their deaths carried out with chilling precision. And most disturbing of all, the person who did this had vanished into the darkness, leaving behind no witnesses, no clear motive, and no immediate suspects. The town of Gatton, once a place of peace, had just become home to one of the most horrifying crimes in Australian history. When the first officers and townspeople arrived at the scene of the murders, they were met with a sight so disturbing, so carefully staged, that even the most seasoned men among them struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. In the open paddock, just off the main road between Gatton and their family's farm, lay the bodies of Michael, Nora, and Teresa Murphy. They were not simply left for dead. They had been positioned with chilling deliberation, arranged in a manner that felt almost ritualistic. Their lifeless forms had been placed in a triangular formation, their heads pointing outward, as if the killer had crafted a scene meant to send a message. The brutality of the attack was staggering. Michael Murphy, the eldest, had been struck repeatedly in the head, likely with a heavy blunt object, perhaps a rifle or an iron bar. His skull had been shattered, and deep wounds marked the side of his face. The force of the blows was so severe that it suggested not just a desire to kill, but a level of rage and intent that felt deeply personal. Nora and Teresa Murphy had been killed in a similar fashion, their heads bludgeoned with extreme force, their bodies left exposed in a way that suggested a sexual element to the crime. Their skirts were lifted, but there was no conclusive evidence of sexual assault, a fact that only deepened the mystery. Adding to the unsettling nature of the crime scene, Michael's horse had been shot and killed, its lifeless body still harnessed to the sulky. Whoever had done this was not satisfied with simply taking 3 lives. They wanted to erase everything that remained of that night. The entire scene felt purposeful, controlled. There were no signs of a struggle, no scattered belongings, no clear evidence that the victims had tried to fight back. Had they been ambushed? Had the killer forced them out of the carriage at gunpoint? Or had they known the person responsible, so much so that they felt no fear until it was too late? The murders had taken place on a quiet road, under the cover of darkness. But even in a small town where everyone knew everyone, no one had seen or heard a thing. There were no reports of gunshots. No witnesses had come forward with anything suspicious. The area, though remote, wasn't completely isolated, yet the crime had been committed in eerie silence. Even more disturbingly, there were no clear footprints leading away from the scene. While the ground around the bodies had been disturbed, there was no evidence of a person walking away from the paddock. The killer had vanished as if swallowed by the night. Some in town believed the crime had been planned well in advance. Why would the killer stage the bodies in such an unnatural way? What was the significance of the triangle formation? Was it meant to be a symbol, a signature, or simply a taunt to investigators? Then, there was the most chilling detail of all. At some point, after the murders, but before the authorities arrived, someone had returned to the crime scene. Some of the victims' clothing had been disturbed, as if the murderer had lingered, watching the aftermath unfold. Had they been reliving their crime? Had they wanted to make sure they hadn't left behind any evidence, or were they waiting to see who would come looking for the bodies? At first, investigators searched for any obvious motive. Was this a robbery gone wrong? Unlikely. Nothing had been stolen. The Murphys' valuables were still on their bodies. Was it a crime of passion? Possible, but no known romantic conflicts involving Nora or Teresa existed. Could it have been a planned execution? If so, who would have wanted them dead? Then, a chilling question arose. Could this have been the work of a serial killer? The ritualistic positioning of the bodies, the sheer brutality of the attack, and the lack of any clear motive pointed to something far more sinister than an ordinary murder. If that were true, who else had this person killed before? And who might they have killed afterward? But before authorities could properly analyze the crime scene, before they could secure crucial evidence, before they could even begin to connect the pieces of this gruesome mystery, they made a catastrophic mistake that would haunt the case forever. They allowed the crime scene to be contaminated. The Murphy siblings were dead, but now, thanks to police incompetence, the truth behind their murders was also being buried. If the Gatton murders had happened decades later with modern forensic tools and investigative techniques, there might have been a chance to solve the case. But in 1898, with no forensic science, no fingerprint analysis, and no proper crime scene procedures, the truth was doomed from the start. What should have been a systematic and thorough investigation became one of the greatest failures in Australian criminal history. Within hours of the crime scene being discovered, word spread throughout Gatton. Locals flocked to the paddock, horrified by what had happened. By the time police formally took control of the area, dozens of people had walked through it, touching evidence, moving items, and even repositioning the bodies. What could have been crucial forensic details, footprints, weapon traces, signs of a struggle, were all destroyed by careless handling. The local police force was completely unprepared for such a brutal and complex crime. Investigators failed at every level, making errors that would doom the case before it had even begun. The bodies were moved almost immediately. Instead of leaving the victims undisturbed until a proper medical examination could be conducted, onlookers touched and adjusted their positions out of morbid curiosity. No proper forensic examination was performed. A doctor was called, but his examination was rushed and incomplete. Critical details, such as the exact time of death, the angle of the injuries, and whether the victims had been drugged, were never recorded. Potential evidence was ignored or mishandled. The weapons used to kill the Murphy siblings were never found, likely because the search was rushed and uncoordinated. Any items that could have contained the killer's fingerprints or DNA were contaminated or disregarded entirely. Witnesses were not properly questioned. In the hours after the crime, multiple people reported seeing suspicious individuals near the area, but police either ignored these leads or failed to follow up. By the time investigators from Brisbane arrived, several days later, the damage had already been done. The crime scene was useless, and the first crucial days of the investigation had been completely wasted. Some believed that the police were simply incapable of handling such a serious case. Others believed something far more sinister, that the investigation was being sabotaged from the inside. Did the killer have connections to law enforcement? Was someone in power protecting the murderer? Did the authorities want this case to go unsolved? Some of the biggest mistakes in the investigation seemed almost deliberate. Despite the urgency of the situation, police took over 24 hours to begin a formal search for evidence. By the time they got around to it, the crime scene had been trampled. Beyond recognition, key items such as clothing, possible murder weapons, and even the victim's personal belongings had been moved or lost. The Brisbane detectives who arrived later were experts, but the local police resisted their assistance. Instead of cooperating, they dismissed crucial leads, ignored suggestions, and treated the case with shocking apathy. Some locals claimed they had seen blood-stained clothing near the crime scene that mysteriously disappeared before investigators arrived. A pair of men's boots spotted near the paddock was also never collected. Several townspeople later admitted that they had overheard police dismissing potential suspects without even questioning them. Within weeks, authorities began treating the case as hopeless. No serious suspects were pursued, no further evidence was collected, and the official stance became that the crime would never be solved. Was this mere incompetence, or was something far more sinister at play? Among the many theories that have surrounded the Gatton murders, one of the most controversial is the idea that the authorities actively covered up the truth. Some historians believe that the killer may have been someone within the police force itself, or at least someone with close ties to law enforcement. Consider this. Michael Murphy had once been a police officer. Did he make an enemy during his time in service? Why was the crime scene tampered with so heavily? If the killer was an outsider, why was so little effort made to preserve evidence? Why did the police resist outside help? If they truly wanted to solve the crime, why were they so dismissive of critical leads? One theory suggests that the Murphys may have accidentally discovered something they weren't supposed to see on the road that night. Perhaps illegal activity, police corruption, or even another crime in progress. If that were the case, someone powerful enough to influence the investigation could have ensured the truth was buried along with them. But if the Gatton police were covering something up, there was one problem. The people of the town wanted justice, and they weren't going to let the case be forgotten so easily. As days turned into weeks and then months, the people of Gatton began to lose faith in their own law enforcement. They knew something was wrong. Rumors began to spread. Some said the killer was a high-ranking official. Others believed the police were being paid off. Many felt that powerful figures wanted the case to disappear. Tensions boiled over when authorities officially closed the investigation without making a single arrest. In an era where justice was swift and public hangings were common, the idea that 3 innocent people could be murdered without consequence was unthinkable. People began whispering among themselves, if the murderer was still out there, could they strike again? Was the town harboring a killer without knowing it? And would the truth ever come to light? Despite the public outcry, the case slipped into silence. The Murphy family never saw justice. The killer, or killers, vanished into the shadows of history. But the questions never went away. Who killed Michael, Nora, and Teresa Murphy? And why? With the police investigation in shambles, the focus shifted to the suspects. Those who may have had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to commit one of the most infamous unsolved murders in Australian history. And one name in particular would come up again and again. With no clear motive, no witnesses, and a crime scene contaminated beyond repair, investigators were left with a grim reality. The killer had vanished without a trace. But that did not stop the town of Gatton and later researchers from searching for answers. If the crime wasn't random, then someone must have had a reason to kill Michael, Nora, and Teresa Murphy. Over the years, several theories emerged, some plausible, some speculative, and some disturbing. One of the earliest theories focused on Michael Murphy himself. Before returning to farm life, Michael had briefly served as a police officer. He was known to be a disciplined and respectable man. But had he made an enemy during his time in uniform? Could he have arrested someone who wanted revenge? Did he cross paths with a criminal who later sought retribution? Was he targeted and his sisters murdered as collateral damage? At the time, the police force had many connections to criminal activity, with corruption running deep. It's possible Michael knew something he wasn't supposed to know, something that cost him his life. But there was no evidence to support this, and no records of Michael being involved in any cases serious enough to warrant execution-style murders. If Michael was the target, why was the crime staged in such a disturbing, ritualistic manner? This theory, while intriguing, failed to answer many of the case's stranger details. Some believed the Murphys were killed not out of revenge, but by someone who had killed before and would kill again. In the late 19th century, Australia was still largely unexplored, and long stretches of wilderness made for the perfect hiding place. Could a lone killer have roamed the countryside, attacking victims at random? Historians have pointed out striking similarities between the Gatton Murders and another horrific crime that took place just 2 years earlier, the 1896 murder of Alfred Hill in Oxley, Queensland. Both crimes took place in rural Queensland. Both involved victims being bludgeoned to death. Both crime scenes showed signs of staging, with the victims' bodies arranged deliberately. In both cases, no suspects were ever caught. Could it be that the same killer struck again in Gatton? If so, who were they? One theory suggests a drifter, someone who moved between towns, evading capture. At the time, Australia was filled with itinerant workers, men who traveled alone for weeks or months at a time, looking for work. Had one of them passed through Gatton and seen the Murphy sisters? Had they followed the family, waiting for the right moment to strike? Could they have planned the attack, then vanished into the wilderness? The problem with this theory was the absence of evidence. There were no reports of suspicious strangers in Gatton that night, and no other crimes of this nature were linked with certainty. Still, some believed the killer was not a local, but an outsider, someone who took advantage of the darkness, struck with precision, and disappeared forever. Of all the theories, the one that haunted Gatton the most was the possibility that the killer had been someone from their own town. Was it possible that the Murphy siblings knew their murderer? Consider the facts. There were no signs of a struggle. This could mean that the killer was someone they trusted, at least at first. The victims were killed with extreme precision. This suggests that the attack was planned, not spontaneous. The way the bodies were staged suggested a deeper meaning. If the killer was a local, they may have had a personal reason for arranging the scene the way they did. One name that has come up repeatedly in research and speculation is Thomas Day. Day was a butcher in Gatton. He was known for being strong, experienced in handling weapons, and somewhat of an outsider in town. Most disturbingly, he was near the crime scene that night. He was one of the first people to search for the missing siblings. He knew the Murphy family. Some believed that Day had a fixation on one of the Murphy sisters, perhaps Teresa. If she rejected his advances, could he have lured the group off the road, attacked them, and arranged their bodies in a grotesque display of power? However, there was no conclusive proof against him, and he was never arrested or officially charged. One of the most enduring theories is that the Gatton murders were never solved because the killer was protected by someone in power. The failures of the police investigation were too numerous, too convenient, and too unusual. They let the crime scene be contaminated. They dismissed promising leads. They discouraged independent investigations. They resisted outside help from Brisbane detectives. These failures led many to believe that someone in law enforcement knew more than they let on. Was the real killer connected to the police force? Some have even suggested that the killer was a member of law enforcement himself. Could an officer have crossed paths with the Murphys that night? Could they have ordered them off the road, attacked them, then used their authority to cover it up? Was Michael's past as a policeman connected to his death? If this was true, it would explain the strange, deliberate mistakes made in the investigation. Despite the numerous theories, no one has ever been able to conclusively prove who killed the Murphy siblings. If it was a revenge killing, who had a grudge strong enough to stage such a gruesome crime? If it was a serial killer, why were there no other known victims? If it was a local, why did no one come forward? If it was someone with police connections, was the entire investigation compromised from the start? Over a century later, the case remains open, but no closer to being solved. The truth is buried somewhere in history, but the town of Gatton has never forgotten the night when 3 innocent siblings set out for a dance and never came home. With the police investigation in ruins, all that remained were theories, speculation, and fear. Had the killer gotten away with it because of sheer luck, or had they been protected? Was this a crime of opportunity or something planned long before that fateful night? While the case eventually faded from public consciousness, the Murphy family never received the justice they deserved. And somewhere in the shadows of history, the real killer was allowed to walk free. But while time can erase evidence, it cannot erase a legacy. And the Gatton murders would become one of Australia's most infamous unsolved crimes, a case that still haunts the town, more than a century after the last breath was taken on that desolate road. More than a century has passed since Michael, Nora, and Teresa Murphy were brutally murdered on a quiet road just outside of Gatton, Queensland. The landscape has changed, the town has grown, and those who once whispered theories about the case have long since passed away. But some stories refuse to be forgotten. The Gatton murders remain one of Australia's oldest and most disturbing unsolved crimes. It is a case defined by bizarre details, police incompetence, and an eerie absence of answers. Unlike most murder investigations, which start with at least some form of evidence, this case began on the worst possible footing: a contaminated crime scene, a delayed response, and authorities who seemed unwilling or incapable of solving the crime. The result? One of the most haunting cold cases in Australian history. Even in 1898, murder cases had at least a chance of resolution. Law enforcement relied on eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, and motive to track down criminals. But in Gatton, all of those elements fell apart before they could be properly examined. The biggest obstacles to solving the case were the very people responsible for investigating it. The police never properly secured the crime scene, allowing dozens of locals to walk through it, contaminating potential evidence. They delayed their search for suspects, assuming, against all logic, that the killer would return to the area. Key leads were ignored, mismanaged, or actively suppressed, fueling rumors that someone in law enforcement knew more than they were letting on. And then there were the baffling details that seemed almost too strange to be coincidental. The carefully staged bodies, a triangle formation that suggested ritualistic intent. The lack of signs of a struggle. Had the victims been forced into compliance at gunpoint, or did they know their killer? The fact that the horse was shot, but the gun was never recovered. Was this meant to eliminate a witness, or did the shooter want to erase all traces of their presence? For decades, these questions have been asked over and over again, and yet no definitive answers have ever been found. Today, forensic science is more advanced than ever before. DNA analysis, modern ballistics, and blood spatter examination have Solve decades-old cold cases, giving closure to families who once thought justice would never come. Could these techniques be used to finally determine what happened to the Murphy siblings? The answer is complicated. The crime scene was never properly documented, meaning that crucial evidence is either lost or irreversibly compromised. The murder weapon was never recovered, eliminating any chance of ballistic analysis. No DNA was ever collected, since forensic techniques did not exist at the time. Even if some small traces of evidence still exist today, they would be so degraded that modern forensic analysis would likely yield little new information. But there is one thing that modern science cannot erase: the human element of crime solving. If the right people had been interviewed, if the right suspects had been pursued, and if the investigation had not been botched at every level, perhaps the truth would have been revealed long before the science even became necessary. Instead, the case remains a black hole in Australian criminal history, where theories have filled the void left behind by the absence of justice. Even in the absence of physical evidence, theories continue to circulate, some logical, some bizarre, and some unsettling in what they suggest. The case has been revisited in books, articles, and crime research circles, with some investigators attempting to reconstruct what might have happened using historical records, witness statements, and psychological profiling. Despite the passage of time, certain key theories refuse to disappear. The serial killer theory suggests that the Gatton murders were not isolated, and that similar crimes occurred both before and after the incident, potentially linking multiple murders across Queensland. The police cover-up theory argues that the failures in the investigation were not accidental, but intentional, designed to protect someone powerful. The local predator theory remains one of the strongest, pointing to a person known to the victims, who orchestrated their deaths with chilling precision. Yet, for all the speculation, one simple fact remains: no one was ever arrested. Whoever committed the crime got away with it, living out the rest of their days, knowing they had ended 3 innocent lives, and that no one had ever caught them. There are some places where the past never truly fades, and in Gatton, the shadow of December 26, 1898 still lingers. The land where the Murphy siblings were murdered remains, though time has erased the physical evidence. The crime scene, once a place of horror and unanswered questions, is now just an ordinary paddock, where the only sounds are the rustling of trees and the distant hum of passing cars. But for those who know the story, Gatton has never been just another town. The Gatton murders remain a cautionary tale, a mystery without an ending, and a case that stands as a reminder of what happens when justice is lost to time. Perhaps the most haunting part of the case is not what we know, but what we will never know. Was the killer someone the Murphy siblings trusted, unaware of their fate until the last possible moment? Did the murderer stay in Gatton, living among the people who unknowingly sheltered them? Or did they vanish into history, carrying the weight of their crime in silence? The world has changed since 1898, but some crimes remain timeless. The Gatton murders will always stand as one of Australia's greatest mysteries, a case that remains unsolved, unexplained, and unforgettable. Perhaps the answers were lost the moment the first footprints disturbed the crime scene. Perhaps the killer was more careful than we realize, ensuring no clues were left behind. Or perhaps, in some old record, in a forgotten confession, in the mind of a descendant who still holds onto a dark family secret, the truth still exists, waiting to be uncovered. For now, the case remains frozen in time. Michael, Nora, and Teresa Murphy left their home on a warm summer night, expecting to return. They never did. And more than a century later, we are still asking the same question: who killed the Murphy siblings, and why? The sun still rises over Gatton, just as it did on the morning of December 27, 1898, when the Murphy family awoke to find 3 of their children missing. the land that once bore witness to one of Australia's most gruesome. Unsolved murders has since been reclaimed by time. The paddock, where Michael, Nora and Teresa Murphy were found, is now just another stretch of farmland, indistinguishable from the fields around it. But some places hold on to their ghosts. For the people who still remember, for the historians who continue to investigate, and for the families whose ancestors were part of this tragedy, the Gatton murders have never faded into history. Instead, they have become a legend, a story whispered in crime circles, and a chilling reminder of how justice can slip through the cracks, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and cold, empty silence. For the Murphy family, the years after the murders were filled with grief, frustration, and a deep sense of betrayal. They had lost 3 loved ones in a crime so brutal it shocked the entire country. And yet, rather than receiving swift justice, they watched. As the police fumbled the investigation, suspects slipped away and the case slowly collapsed under its own weight. There were no arrests. No one was held accountable. The killer was never named. Their trust in law enforcement was shattered. Some members of the Murphy family never spoke publicly about the case again, refusing to discuss the horrific details that had become a dark stain on their family history. Others died, still demanding answers, unable to let go of the idea that the person responsible was out there somewhere, free. Even today, descendants of the Murphy family still wonder what truly happened that night. But the truth, if it still exists, is buried beneath more than a century of silence. For Gatton itself, the murders became both a source of fascination and fear. In the immediate years following the crime, townspeople whispered theories about who had done it, why it had happened, and whether the killer still walked among them. Some were convinced that the truth had been covered up, while others feared that a murderer had escaped justice and moved on to kill again. Eventually, as generations passed, the case faded from daily conversation. But even as the crime drifted into the background, it never truly disappeared. The Gatton murders have remained a permanent fixture in Australian true crime history. Books, articles, and crime documentaries have attempted to unravel the mystery, but no one has ever come close to solving it. With no forensic evidence, no official suspects, and no surviving witnesses, all we have left is speculation, theories, and a disturbing sense of unfinished justice. Somewhere in the early days after the murders, the person who committed this horrific crime must have sat in silence, listening as news of their act spread through Gatton and beyond. Did they feel fear, knowing they could be caught at any moment? Did they revel in the chaos, watching the town panic while the police scrambled for answers? Or did they go about their lives as if nothing had happened, calm, composed, knowing that they had left no trace of themselves behind? One thing is clear. Whoever killed the Murphy siblings never faced consequences. They lived out their days, in the shadows, taking the truth with them. And yet the weight of such a crime does not simply disappear. If the murderer was a local, then someone in Gatton, perhaps an unsuspecting wife, a child, or a close friend, once sat across from them, at the dinner table, unaware that they were dining with a monster. If they were an outsider, they may have moved on to commit other crimes, vanishing into the vast, untamed land that was Australia in the late 19th century. Did they ever feel remorse? Or did they die with their secret intact, knowing that time would eventually erase all traces of what they had done? Even after more than 120 years, certain questions still refuse to let go. Why were the bodies arranged in a triangle formation? Was this a message, a ritual, or something more personal? Why was the horse shot? Was it simply to eliminate a witness, or did it serve a symbolic purpose? Why did the police fail so miserably? Were they truly incompetent, or was there something more sinister at play? Was this a one-time crime, or was the killer a repeat offender? And most importantly, who did this? These are the questions that haunt the Gatton murders, and likely always will. Some believe the truth is still out there, buried in an old diary, a forgotten police report, or a passing comment made by a guilty man in his final days. Others accept that this case will never be solved, that the story has become not just a crime, but a legend, one that will never have an ending. But whether or not the truth is ever uncovered, one thing is certain. Michael, Nora, and Teresa Murphy set out for a simple trip on a warm summer evening, never knowing it would be their last. They were not meant to vanish into history, to become just another unsolved mystery. But history is cruel, and justice in this case never came. The Gatton murders will always be remembered as one of the darkest, most perplexing crimes in Australian history. Even now, when the town of Gatton is mentioned, it is impossible to separate it from the horror that unfolded on that road in 1898. For the Murphy family, for the town, and for the countless crime researchers who have tried to solve this case, the pain of that night still lingers. The Gatton murders remain a story without an ending, a crime without justice, and a warning that even the safest of places can hold darkness. And as long as that darkness remains, so too does the question that will never be answered. Who killed the Murphy siblings, and why?